verses 13 through 24 and 25 is what we will be covering today. And as I've mentioned before, we are going to be working our way through the book of John. The book of John has 21 chapters. There will not be, unfortunately, we will not do 21 sermons through this book. If we were to take as much time and detail on everything that could be covered, I believe that we could sit for 7 years inside of this book. So I'm instead going to try to jump through and maybe about 8 to 12 sermons hitting on some major points. But John chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. And as you're getting there, I want you just to think about this question. How are you personally functioning in your community in relationship to others and the worship of God? Are you one who is an obstacle to those around you, where it is more difficult for them to worship the Lord because of your relationship with them and what you represent? Or are you someone who helps usher people into the presence of God through your conversations, through your actions, through the way that you function inside the community? Think about these things now as I read John 2, verses 13 through 25. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins and the money changers, overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house consumed me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. Now, this is one of the more famous passages inside of the Gospels. In fact, it is repeated in all the synoptics, which would be the other Gospels. So this is the story of Jesus overturning the money changers' tables. It's known. It's in the Gospels. I haven't had the opportunity to reenact it physically. No one's asked me to be in a play where I get to do this. But I think it's in almost every single comic version of the Bible. If you're looking at kids' Bible, maybe not super small kids, but it's there. Now, because it's there and it's known and it's around, there's lots of guesses as to why Jesus was doing what he was doing and what does it then justify further. And I want to just pause and quickly say, Jesus turning over the money changers' table once or twice in his entire ministry is not something that should be the vision statement for someone saying, well, Jesus was violent, therefore I'm just going to go around overthrowing everything possible. No. In fact, if you look at the account, there was a reason why he did this, and you look in the other Gospels, this was something that was planned in advance. He knew what was going on, and he knew what he was confronting. So next time you get angry at someone and do something to them, please don't quote, well, Jesus overturned money changer tables. I've heard people use this as an example to justify their violence. This is not just a justification of violence. This is Jesus making a proclamation and a declaration about who he is. And this passage touches on one of the heart issues in the book of John, which is the temple and the right worship of God. Interestingly enough, whenever you read the first 2 chapters in light of the question of the temple of God and who is Jesus and what is the worship of God, a couple of items stand out. Now, you can look back, it's probably on the exact same page or a page earlier, to John chapter 1, verses 50 and 51. Jesus had just called Nathanael to be one of his disciples, and Nathanael is just astounded. This guy knew I was sitting by a fig tree. Now, that being said, there had been something culturally significant about how it would have been crazy that he knew this. But Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than that." He then added, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Now, I point that out because I have read the book of John dozens of times. I've read it in many translations, and I never caught until just this week. What is the bridge between heaven and earth in that verse that the angels are going up and down on? What is the bridge? Jesus. Jesus himself is the bridge between heaven and earth. And this is recalling back to Jacob and his ladder, where Jacob, he sees God and he sees angels going back and forth on an actual ladder. And this here, Jesus is saying, I am that ladder between heaven and earth. And then in 2:21, Jesus says, well, the disciples finally realized that Jesus was saying that the temple, that he himself is the temple. And in 1:23, I know this is a lot of going back, but flip back to the start of chapter 1, and I'm going to point out something that this is very vital in knowing as we talk about the meaning of Jesus driving things out of the temple. So John the Baptist, Mr. Crazy hair, crazy clothes, eats whatever he can that a Nazarite can do. People are like, "Are you the Messiah? Who are you? Are you a prophet?" And he says, "All right, I am the voice of one calling in the wilderness. Make straight the way for the Lord." Now, this is echoing back to Isaiah, where the Israelites are scattered abroad. They're not living in Israel. They're outside of the bounds of the nation of Israel and definitely outside the bounds of Jerusalem. And in order for them to come back to the temple and worship, there would have to be a clearing of obstacles. You know, if you and I wanted to go to, let's just say, Peoria, we'd hop in our car, we'd swerve around a couple curves, an hour and a half later, depending on who's driving, we'd get to Peoria. Right? Simple. Smooth. Now instead, imagine of driving there, it is 150 years ago and you're having to walk to Peoria. There's a couple hollers, a couple cricks, couple hills, and it wouldn't be simple, right? And it'd be nice if someone just came through and paved a flat way to get there. Our modern roadway actually demonstrates this Isaiah call of make straight the way of the Lord, make clear. And inside of that, it's in literature be called a double entendre, where it's meaning two different things, where it's one day there will be the people of Israel returned back, and they'll be able to be physically able to come back, but then it's also the spiritual worship of the Lord. What are the obstacles in the way of worshiping God? that need to be removed. All right? Now, with that, keep that in mind. What are the obstacles that need to be removed? And then when you read through the Gospels, what are the obstacles in the way of people worshiping the Lord? It gets more and more explicit depending on where you are in the Gospels. But right after Jesus overturns the money tables, listen to this. The Jews responded to him saying, "What sign can you show to us to prove your authority to do all this?" Who's opposing Jesus as he's trying to help people do something? The Jews. And then later, you have the scribes, the Pharisees. You have the Romans themselves. You have all these different things that are shown to be obstacles for worship. Now, with that as background, I want to reread the first few verses. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Just a quick geographical aside. Jerusalem's on a hill. So anyone from Israel, whenever, I don't know about you guys, whenever you talk about going someplace, I'm going up to or I'm going down to, we just say haphazardly a direction, doesn't matter north, south, east, west. Well, in Israel, Jerusalem, in order to get there, you're going to have to go down a hill at some point and up to Jerusalem. So you are always going up to Jerusalem, no matter where you come from. You're going up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, doves, and other things sitting at the tables, exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins on the money changers' tables and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get out from here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." The disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." What do you need to have in order to have a sacrifice? An animal. You need to have doves, cattle, and sheep. So there is nothing wrong with the animals in this passage. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with the sale of animals in of itself. If you are walking 200 miles to make it to the Passover, you're leaving a long time in advance. And there is no way that you're going to keep your animal pure on that whole trip. Make sure that they are ready for a sacrifice. So you have the sale of animals inside of Jerusalem. In fact, the prophet Amos most likely was one of the people who was in charge of helping sell sheep inside of centuries before this. This was common. But verse 14 starts off with a little clause that is really important, a little phrase. Where was the selling of these animals and the exchanging of the money happening? In the temple courts. All right, so if imagine I am a Jewish man. As a Jewish man, I can go pretty far in until like the exact temple itself. Then you have to be a priest or a Levite to go inside the temple. Like there's a couple rooms, and then you have to be the high priest to go into the Holy of Holies. So there's the inner courts and the outer courts. The inner courts, the Jewish men can go to. Who's in the outer courts? The Jewish women and the Gentile, the term is proselytes, the Gentiles who want to become Jews but are not, or who want to worship the Lord but are not Jews. So they go to the temple courts. Now, we've all been to the fair, right? Imagine if you're trying to get to, the grandstand. And instead of it being a clear area for you to stand, all the cattle that the 4-H are showing are there. And all the vendors are right there, and you can't actually physically get in there. And if you can, it's noisy and it's loud, and you can't actually worship. Jesus is confronting the reality that the temple courts, which is supposed to be where the outer groups of people Think then now to the Samaritan woman in an upcoming chapter, or the Syrophoenician woman in a different book, or all the people that he heals who are unclean. So the outer temple courts, people can't enter into it. This is a literal obstacle to worship happening. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit because this is a passage that is a lot of talking points in different areas. I know of a couple churches where if you are going to do a fundraiser, the elders or the deacons or the pastors in that church will not let you do the fundraiser inside that church. Because Jesus cast out the money changers, and this is supposed to be a house of worship, and so any sale of anything inside of the church is breaking this. That's not what this passage is. If you're selling 4-H cookies, it's not against Jesus to sell it inside the church. Now, that being said, please don't do it during the sermon or the songs. I would not appreciate it. So there's more that's going on. It's not just there can't be sales, there can't be market, there can't be those sort of ideas, but are those obstacles. Because where these animals should have been sold was outside of the temple courts, which is where they had maybe oftentimes historically been sold. And there's nothing wrong with the exchanging of money, because only a pure coin would be accepted inside of the temple. You're not supposed to have any coins with the image of a person on it, because that would be breaking the Ten Commandments, a graven image. So if you're walking around with your coins with Caesar on the front of it, you shouldn't be putting that inside of the temple. So money changers, that makes sense. Now some people have brought up the fact that money changers charged a percent or whatever. Well, how else do you make money without having a profit? I mean, you literally can't be a money changer if you can't earn income. So Jesus isn't against the actions happening. He's against where they're happening and what they're inhibiting. I'm also going to point out again, people have brought this verse up to say, well, you can be crazy wild for things. Jesus even made a whip. Now, that being said, one insightful commentator brought up something that I'm pretty sure those of you who've worked with cattle know. If you're in a courtyard with a bunch of cows and sheep, how are you going to get them to move? You need something to move them. That's why he had the whip. It was to prod the animals forward. This was not just making a whip to look crazy. Everything that Jesus does in this passage is on purpose. In the overturning of the money changer tables, he's saying this area is not supposed to be a market. So, all of that would probably be abstract until he then talks about his body being the sign. The fact that his body was going to be torn down and built back up in 3 days. A foreshadowing of the resurrection. An interesting note, they say that the temple took 46 years to build at that point. It was still in the process of being built. It wasn't until about 34 to 40 years after this that it was finished, right before the Jews then tried to completely revolt against Rome, and Rome then burned the temple. And you can now see the bottom stones. So the physical temple that's going on here that matters is the body of Jesus Christ. Now, we all have the privilege, the advantage, the blessing to be able to worship God through Jesus, for he is the ladder between heaven and earth. And he is the actual temple of God. He is the dwelling of God, as John 1 says. But this is where the next step moves into the question of why do all the gospel writers record this? Because it is significant, this event of moving out the obstacles to the worship of God. And if you read through all the New Testament letters, it seems as though we people who worship Jesus, we have a real knack for something. we like to make the worship of Jesus difficult. We add things to it. We add obstacles, or we make it harder for someone else to want to come to Jesus. And this is not at all being anti-forms and liturgies. This isn't, there's nothing wrong with an order of service. There's nothing wrong with traditions. Jesus doesn't say, no more Passovers. This is, what are the obstacles that we have placed in our life or in the life of this church that keep people from being able to worship God? The first and most obvious one that we need to start at is the area of commerce, the area of trade, the area of market. How are we using our finances individually and as a church? Are we doing so in a manner that makes people believe that we are about the worship of God or about something else? It's been said before in different sermons, and it's in about every single book on whether or not a church is going to die or a church is going to live. Is the budget of the church about the church and the church building, or is the budget about the church and how can we bless others and minister to others? How many times have you heard someone say that churches are all about making money? The statement is, once you start taxing churches, no one will give money to a church anyways because it's not a charitable organization. Like, there's just this complete distrust towards the church and giving and finances, partially because there are people who use religion to line their pockets. We can't deny that reality. But if a church uses its budget to bless those outside of it, instead of hindering those from the outside to wanting to come in, that's an issue. So, a question for you to reflect on personally throughout this week is how I'm going about the area of commerce, trade, or economy, showing people that God is the object of worship, or is it keeping people from wanting to worship the same God that you worship, who then turns a blind eye to what you're doing? The next area that I want to think about then is your religious practices and of itself an obstacle towards people wanting to worship the Lord? Verse 18, it says, the Jews responded to him, what sign can you give to us to prove your authority? Now this is fairly good that they did that. I mean, if someone came in and said, and overturned our sound system and said, you guys aren't a true church, I'd want to say, now, how do you know that? I mean, we'd want that person to verify it, right? And Jesus' verification is the fact that he was going to raise from the dead. But the question that I then bring from this is, how do our practices either incorporate people to want to come in, or does it feel exclusive? Do people feel lost by what we do? I mean, think about this. Someone were to ask you, how do I pray and why do I pray? Is your answer really garbly and, well, we say these and thous and you have to pray this way? Or are you able to explain to that person just the simplicity of what it is? When someone walks into the doors of a church, now this is a very, I will say, touchy topic. Do they feel as though that in order to worship God, that you're demonstrating to them that they have to dress or appear a certain way? Whether it be their lifestyle, they have to clean up, or if they have to have their Sunday best on in order to come to church. Oftentimes, I believe that the notion of Sunday best is misunderstood by those who don't grow up inside a church. I wear my Sunday best, so to say, because I want to have an attitude of worship in just that day, this moment, this service. But some people have the idea that a Sunday best is, I can live however I want Monday through Saturday night, but all I got to do is slap on some good clothes, and that's all that matters. That's not right. Which then moves over to that the continued conversation, does your life show people that Jesus is worth worshiping? If there's no difference between how you operate and how someone who has no knowledge of Jesus operates, how is that going to cause someone else to want to move closer to Jesus? If being a Christian coach doesn't mean anything, if being a Christian farmer doesn't make you a different kind of farmer, if being a Christian teacher doesn't look any different, and in fact, I've often heard people who are Christians dismiss any ideas that they need to be better because, well, Jesus loves me anyways. I want to just remind us that those are obstacles. There should be a transformation. There should be a holiness. There should be a reverence about our attitude towards God and then our ability to relate to others. Inside of this temple court, where all those who are supposed to be considered outsiders had the chance to then come in and worship, the message being given to them was, you're not as valuable as our cattle, our sheep, and our prophet. And in fact, I do want to add just another further note. In the other Gospels, whenever Jesus overthrows, in the other accounts, when Jesus throws over the money changers' tables, he says, it has been written, you will call my house a house of worship, but you have made it into a den of thieves. Now, interestingly enough, that term for thief, you and I think about the person who puts on a mask, breaks into a house, and steals a TV and goes out. That idea for thief actually is more so associated with the idea of the zealots of the day who would be counter Rome, and then there's actually this den of thieves, this idea of hiding inside of the temple, inside of the courts, because the Romans weren't allowed past a certain point in the temple because they were unclean Romans. So the zealous terrorism of the Jewish zealots, they would hide inside of the temple courts because the Romans couldn't touch them there because the temple court was pure and holy. They were using the holiness of God to hide their act of terror rather than worshiping the Lord. So, I introduced this sermon asking, what are the obstacles that you have in your life and the obstacles that we are setting up in this church that keep others from wanting to worship the Lord? I don't think that the temple leaders realized that what was going on became an issue and an obstacle for the worship of the Lord. I think that it was something gradual, something slow, something that was very justified. We have to be able to let people get their sacrifices in. We have to let people do this. And then it just became an obstacle. Obstacles like this are built up whenever you have a lower view of God and a lower view of his actual worship. Whenever you have the ends justify the means mentality about things. Because if the ends justify the means, then you can get rid of following the one who gave you the very commands themselves. Much of the Old Testament is the discussion of all these items. So, as a Christian, do we just have an ends justify the means mentality? If so, I'll be honest. If you ever read or watch the stories about people who deconverted from Christianity to atheism, that's one of the things. They saw Christianity was just a means to an end to these people. It wasn't an actual worship. They saw through it, and their religion, again, was attacked, and they couldn't justified. So, if we want to make sure that we're not allowing obstacles for the worship of the Lord, we have to sit inside of the mysterious, the ethereal, the abstract reality that Jesus himself is the temple of God, who must be worshipped as worthy. And that his words are not ones that we just throw around, or that we have our status, or we have, Jesus has to be worshipped, therefore this. But everything about our faith has to be all-consuming, wrapped around Jesus. Making sure that people realize his worth and his holiness, his worthiness. He did die, and he did raise from the grave, showing his message to be true, showing his salvation to ring true, showing that he is the ultimate reason for everything. Later on in this book, Jesus says, you'll worship me in spirit and truth and not an actual physical location. And this then, just all around, puts us back into that question: what are the obstacles in your life and in the life of this church that got built up or that happened without us thinking about it? Just go around. Whether it be being unwelcoming, whether it be how we handle our business, these other items. How our children are cute but like to move around. For those of you watching, my daughter is being crazy. But meditate on these things. Read the word together. Pray. Be humble. Be willing to be confronted by Jesus. Change isn't bad. Change that moves towards Jesus is good.